Invest Africa, proudly brought to you by KPMG.
Hello and a warm welcome to Invest Africa. I'm Natasha Jacobs. Now, Africa may be on the rise, but power supply is still holding the continent back. In South Africa, power utility Eskom makes the headlines almost daily due to supply and management crises. To the west of the continent, Nigeria is privatizing its power supply as it struggles to meet demand. To the east, there are also projects underway to meet their growing energy needs as Kenya tries to spur industrial growth. But even with these projects, it's estimated that $300 billion is still needed in order for all Sub-Saharan African countries to have access to electricity by the year 2030. Can this be done, and what are some of the initiatives needed to reach these energy goals? Well, that's the hot topic on today's agenda, and joining me to share their insights is Professor Mosad Elmissiry, Head of Energy Programs at NEPAD, Andrew Herscowitz, Coordinator for Power Africa. Joining us from our bureau in Nairobi is Yash Krishna, Managing Director for Cummins Cogeneration Kenya, and from our bureau in Lagos, Segun Sowande, Partner, KPMG, Nigeria. Gentlemen, a very warm welcome. Professor, let's get straight into it. Let's paint a picture of the power situation on the African continent. I have a few scary stats here. According to the World Bank, only 25% of Sub-Saharan Africa has access to electricity. And when we look at electricity consumption per capita in Africa, including South Africa, that equates to 1/6 of the world average, and that equates to about electricity consumption in the state of New York. Quite shocking.
Absolutely correct. Actually, there are some parts in Africa where the energy access can be as low as 2%, while there's some other parts in Africa where the energy access is over than 95%. If you look to North Africa, the energy access there is over 90%. But if you consider West Africa and the Central Africa, the energy access is very low. On average, actually you may get different figures. On average, it's actually between 30 and 40% the energy access across Africa. This is a situation where Africa is blessed with enormous resources of energy, be it thermal, hydro, geothermal, the nuclear, renewables, name it. All sources of energy are actually in Africa, but its utilization is really very low. And this is why the head of state and the government, in 2012, they endorsed what we call it Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa. They are fully aware that energy access is very low, and we have to do something.
All right, Andy, and that's where you come in, the Power Africa initiative. Now, it's something that's been talked about in the media quite a bit since 2013. Take us back to where this initiative actually came from in terms of the senior delegation from the US coming to Africa. Tell us what was seen on the ground and why spearhead this project on a continent that is thousands of miles from the US.
Sure, happy to do that, and thanks so much for having us. You know, to give you some perspective, for most of the people who are watching this show right now, the refrigerator that they use consumes more electricity than most people on this continent consume in the entire year. So it really gives you the perspective on the scope of the problem. What Power Africa is, it's President Obama's initiative to double access to electricity in Sub-Saharan Africa through partnership. This is the first presidential initiative ever to be based on the continent of Africa itself. It's the first presidential initiative ever to be based outside of the United States. And what happened was several significant leaders from the United States were traveling around the African continent with others, and they were looking around them, and they were looking at manufacturing, they were looking at companies. These are countries that were on a really steep trajectory of growth.
I mean, we're sitting with 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies globally at the moment.
Well, and they can't remain competitive. If a company in Kenya is producing 80,000 garments a day, and suddenly they lose power, they're really supposed to burn expensive backup diesel generators. They can't do that. They can't remain competitive. They're going to lose out to manufacturing in other countries. So it originally started as an economic growth play, but we quickly realized you can't forget about the millions of people on the African continent who aren't even part of the master plans, which is why Power Africa also launched its Beyond the Grid initiative to get access to power to the poorest of the poor who aren't even going to be connected to the grid within the next 10 or even 20 years.
Yash, partnerships form a big part of the Power Africa initiative. And of course, you are partnering in Kenya. Please take us through what Cummins is doing as part of the initiative in your neck of the woods.
Absolutely. So Cummins Cogeneration Kenya Limited is involved with renewable energy projects which are biomass based across Sub-Saharan Africa. We are initially starting with one project in Baringo where we are using an invasive species called Prosopis juliflora. So this is a weed which was planted in the 70s and 80s across East Africa to stop anti-desertification. Now, this particular weed has taken hundreds and thousands of hectares of land, affecting people's lives, affecting taking over farmland. People can't farm in those areas anymore, and there's no way of getting rid of it. What Cummins Cogeneration Kenya Limited is doing for its first project is using this particular weed, involving over 2,000 people to harvest this particular weed and actually monetize it. So this is one of the first projects we are doing in Africa, with several of them planned across Sub-Saharan Africa, essentially where we think of this technology, the gasification technology which we are using. We feel it's probably the best technology out there for Africa, because it is the only form of power generation which actually has a huge socio-economic impact on the area where it's set up, because the biomass or the feedstock is actually secured from close vicinity. So it not only provides power to the grid or to a consumer, but it also provides large amount of employment in the area we are set up.
Andy, just back to you briefly, how do you identify the projects that you get involved in? This is a project that's already come to fruition, that's also actively bringing energy into the grid. How do you identify those that are viable at the moment?
So I love this project. I love what this Baringo biomass project that Cummins is doing, because Cummins is a company that hadn't been doing these types of projects on the African continent. And because of Power Africa, they came to us, they were looking for opportunities. They hooked up with our teams that are on the ground, because that's what Power Africa is. It's not about people just flying in and flying out. We have teams on the ground in the countries. We call them transaction advisors, supported by multiple agency teams at the US embassies all over the continent. And they're meant to be the eyes and the ears of both what's already in the works, because we see projects in the African continent for years that have been in the works, but they're not going anywhere.
They don't come to implementation.
Well, so we come to them at different stages. This is why Power Africa involves so many partners. We have over 100 private sector partners. We have the World Bank and the African Development Bank, government of Sweden. We have all these different partners who are all rowing in the same direction right now, trying to figure out what are the new deals, what are the old deals, why are the old deals stuck, and what new and exciting things can we do? And this project that Cummins is doing in Kenya is a new and exciting project. And what I love about it is that they're agreeing to look at other countries. A lot of companies will go into the proven markets, but you're trying to get companies going to markets when you have 50 countries. There's incredible opportunity, as a professor pointed out. Africa has everything. You've got enough sun shining on this continent in a minute to power the entire world. So the resources are incredible. So it's just a question of how do you capture these resources, and how do you turn all these great ideas into bankable deals? And that's what Power Africa is working to do, is getting projects to the point of bankability and then making sure that they stay on track so that you can ultimately turn on the lights.
And actually, this is what we are aiming to do from NEPAD. I mean, the way we joined the hand with Power Africa, there's a number of projects in NEPAD, number of projects in PIDA, which hasn't actually moved much. Why? Because the project hasn't reached bankability. That term of bankability is what actually investors want. No investor wants to put his money in a project which is not bankable.
No, because he's looking for a return at some point, yes.
This is why we are using the transaction advisor of Power Africa. We're hoping to use the transaction advisor of Power Africa to really move this project to bankability. Once the project moves to bankability, it will be actually easy to source finance to really implement.
And bankability is also the key to the sustainability, because this is what Power Africa is about. It's about private sector money going in to develop the energy sector and letting governments spend their money on healthcare, letting them spend their money on roads, schools. and letting the private sector pursue bankable projects that'll be more sustainable. Because when a government builds out a project that's not bankable from the government standpoint, it doesn't do anybody any good. It ends up going to government coffers and taking away from all the other things that governments should be doing. So that's what Power Africa is trying to do, is work with the private sector, work with partners like NEPAD to figure out how to bring light to millions of people.
Segun, give us a West African perspective. And speaking of private sector initiatives and investment, of course, we know that Nigeria last year went through a whole renaissance where it looked at the privatization of its energy sector. How are things changing on the ground there? And how are you advising clients to get involved with projects? What are you seeing traction on the ground in terms of Power Africa as well?
In a sense, I think what's happened in Nigeria over the last now roughly about 16 months is we've had a full-blown privatization of the power sector. Now, in a sense, what's happened is overnight we've transitioned from what was essentially, a power, power sector into what's like a power market. Now, the expectations for many people, coming out of that was, in a sense, that the moment the private sector takes over, the lights would come on immediately and things would immediately start to move very quickly. But I think what's basically happened is that, in a sense, the challenges still, the challenges are still with us on an overall basis. The lights are not yet on. Power hasn't changed fundamentally. But from our point of view, what we do see is that there are some fundamental changes that are actually happening as far as the sector is concerned. One of the biggest challenges historically has been around the pricing and adequate, liquidity within the sector on an overall basis. Now, what the private sector and what the privatization program has actually helped us to achieve is to ensure proper accountability across the value chain. One of the key initiatives that we've had to address is to have clarity in terms of the loss levels we have in the sector, in terms of identifying specifically exactly how much does it cost to provide power. And the tariffs have been adjusted to deal with those things. But the big problem still persists. And that has to do with largely the supply of fuel, which is gas. Nigeria being a very gas-rich country, gas is the primary source of fuel. But unfortunately, the gas is not flowing, and the infrastructure is, the transmission infrastructure for gas is still far behind, some of the investments that have been made in terms of generation assets.
Segun,
so
do you think that
what I think has happened?
Segun, sorry to interject there, but do you think that with these, barriers to entry and with these issues, that initiatives like Power Africa could assist to break those barriers? Because these teams are on the ground, they're doing due diligence, they're working with governments, they're working with the private sector. Could that perhaps be an answer to the issues in Nigeria as you see them now? Well,
I will say that we have a very active team on the ground in Nigeria, and we hear from them daily about what's going on there, because there's so much hope for Nigeria to add 20,000 megawatts of new generation. You can go back to him, but I just want to say,
Segun, do you agree with that?
Yeah. In a sense, I think it all comes together gradually. With the support from Power Africa, for instance, the scale of the support that's available for new investments through from US companies, and GE is actually on ground making significant investments. The kind of investments we haven't seen in a long time, not just in terms of putting turbines on ground, but actually putting in place facilities, training facilities with, to train people to actually be able to manage and maintain those systems. That's a remarkable change. Is one of the things that we haven't seen in a long time, which is actually very positive as far as the sector is concerned. Now, in addition to that, when US aid is actually providing all kinds of support, in terms of skilled resources to more or less support the agencies that are responsible for unlocking some of the bottlenecks. And the more we actually do that, the gas will ultimately flow and power would actually become, more widely available. I think what I would say specifically is that there's a bit of patience that's actually required. The investments and all the changes will need some time to actually mature and settle down before the full impact starts to manifest. So it's really just a matter of time. A year ago, I said my own view is that it's going to take some 24 to 36 months for the full impact to actually be felt on ground, particularly because a lot of the conditions precedent around signing gas agreements with the IOCs and the oil companies are actually just coming into effect. And as soon as those happen, the investment around the gas infrastructure would ultimately mean we'll have much more fuel to be able to power existing, capacity on ground.
Okay,
so I mean, I see a situation in the next, I would say 18 months of actually hitting the 10,000 megawatts, which has been the aspiration of the country for quite some time.
Well, we have to take a quick ad break, but we'll be back with more powerful insights straight after this. Stay with CNBC Africa. Welcome back to Invest Africa. Tonight we're focusing on power on the continent. Remember, you can tweet us at CNBC Africa using the hashtag InvestAfrica. Andy, let's get straight back into it and let's talk relationships and relationship building and partnerships on the African continent through Power Africa. You've done your due diligence, your teams have been here, you've set up operations on the ground, but it's also about reaction time. Tell us a bit about what's recently happened in West Africa and how Power Africa has stepped in to assist.
Well, look, the relationships that we've built have allowed us to do incredible things because we have the tools not just from 12 different U.S. government agencies, but multiple partners and 100 companies. So when the Ebola outbreak was at its height in Liberia, we were thinking about people who were suffering in the dark because Liberia is a country that has 23 megawatts of power. To give you a perspective, that's about as much power as certain football stadiums use. Wow. So for the entire country. And we knew that people were not getting power at night. So we reached out to our partners, we shared different ideas, we thought about how could we create an air bridge to get generators into the country. And we realized we didn't even need to do that because our people on the ground knew about generators that were available locally. And within 2 weeks of having this idea of bringing in generation units, we got a picture sent to us from the Ebola treatment units with a caption saying, thanks to these generators that Power Africa provided, we're able to sanitize the clothes that healthcare workers wear. People are able to charge their cell phones and speak with loved ones as they're being treated for Ebola, and we're able to run life-saving equipment. So for me, that wasn't just a Power Africa highlight, that was a career highlight for me to see how the U.S. government and multiple governments and private sector working together can have a real result within 2 weeks that saves people's lives. That never would have happened if Power Africa hadn't existed.
It's a partnership actually, which made us join hand with Power Africa. Through our partnership with Power Africa, we managed to develop what we call it Africa Power Vision.
Because that's a big word, it's partnership.
Partnership, absolutely correct. And through that partnership, as you can see, there is Power Africa Initiative, there was PIDA before, there's Sustainable Energy for All, there's Africa 2020, there's so many initiatives in Africa. And then what the African leader thought, we need to have a vision where all these initiatives feed into it. This is why, through our partnership with Power Africa, we developed what we call it Africa Power Vision. What the African leader actually wants to see the energy going? What level of energy accessibility we want actually to achieve by 2040? So we came with Africa Power Vision, and we set a target to achieve by 2040, 80% for household and 90% for the industry and the commerce. And we developed Africa Power Vision, which has got 5 pillars to really support that vision. And that vision was endorsed by the head of the state and the government last January. And now we are moving from vision to implementation. But this is the most important thing. The vision has already been set. We know where we are going. Now we are going to the implementation of African Power Vision through partnership with Power Africa as well.
These are projects that are going to bring power to millions of people. They're projects that people have been dreaming about for years. But the African leaders themselves have said, this is what we need to do to actually move on these projects. We've seen a million lists out there, enough talking about lists. Let's take this transactional approach and just try to jump into these projects and try to move them forward. So we're partnering with them to try to figure out how we can support this prioritized list to actually move these big projects forward.
Segun, from a West African perspective, we've spoke about implementation, and there's sometimes a lot of red tape around the relationship with government. I mean, Nigeria sometimes gets painted with a very negative brush in the sense of why do things take so much time? But with partnerships like these, are governments becoming more aware and more open to working with private sector, perhaps taking the pressure off them to get things going on the ground?
Yes, I mean, I think things have actually improved from where we were many years ago. I think increasingly, when I look at the West African region in particular, I think governments across West Africa have, more or less gotten into the pattern of working with, what I call development agencies like the World Bank, like USAID, DFID, and the likes. And increasingly, I think the structure has become fairly well defined, and you are almost able to insulate those initiatives and those projects are being supported, in such a manner that the implementation actually gets to happen on ground. And I think when you look at what's happening with respect to the Power Africa initiative, specifically, there are well-defined agreements in terms of what the commitments are supposed to be from the government side point of view, and what the commitment is from the U.S. government and the particular agencies which are actually involved. And you can see increasingly that process is actually starting to work more effectively. There's actually more transparency, and I think that model whereby you actually hive out, the project team that's responsible for such initiatives has actually meant the red tape around those are cut off, and you can actually move fairly quickly. And so I would say things are looking up on that front, and it can only get better.
Andy, how important are MOUs and due diligence on ground?
So MOUs are important, but look, a couple of things that are important to remember. MOUs are important because you want to get those commitments from the governments to make the difficult reforms. Because like I said, there are 50 some odd countries who are competing for business on the African continent. And if one minister isn't willing to make that change that's going to bring in that private sector investment, the company will go elsewhere. There's a lot of competition. It's not one country, it's a lot of countries and a lot of competition. Ethiopia is a perfect example. It's a country that when we first announced Ethiopia as a focus country, people criticized us.
It's a state-regulated country.
They said, how can you do that? Well, what we're seeing because of Power Africa, they're working on this, this geothermal project which pulls clean steam out of the ground. East Africa has some of the best geothermal resources in the world. The Ethiopian government's in the process of negotiating the first private sector geothermal project ever in Ethiopia. But because of that process, it's opening up the market to all kinds of other private sector investment. Ethiopia is sort of at this point, we're all watching this project closely to see it succeed, but not just energy companies, everybody else, telecom companies, everyone else is watching this project to see what happens. Power Africa has helped the Ethiopian government, working with the African Development Bank, hire top quality legal counsel to represent them so that they're negotiating on a level playing field. Where we have a transaction advisor who sits there and gives objective advice to all the parties. So we are sort of up to our ears in this deal, making sure that this succeeds, but providing objective advice so that it's a deal that will last for decades.
Yash, there are three partners, sorry Professor. Yash, there are three partners to this. Obviously government, Power Africa as an initiative, and of course the private sector. How important are these relationships to you as a company? And also you work mostly in Kenya, but we're also looking and talking about expansion into the rest of the region, the rest of the continent. What are you looking forward to?
Absolutely. So basically USAID has managed to essentially integrate the power industry, which is extremely fragmented in Africa. So essentially what USAID has managed to do is bring all the different stakeholders together, from policymakers to funding agencies to investors to technology providers and so on and so forth, creating a climate where we can all exist and actually take our concepts into funding and into actually implementation of projects. Essentially, us as IPPs, we can do a project in 8 to 9 months, but when we talk about a first project, it's taken us 2.5 years, and where we have an issue is essentially getting our waivers and licenses and permissions, which cost a lot of money. There's time value of money involved here, and we lose a lot of money because it takes a year, year and a half before you actually even starting to make orders for your equipment or trying to bring it back to wherever you're setting up the project. So essentially what we look at as IPPs is obviously return on investment. We have the funding, we have the desire to do projects in Sub-Saharan Africa, but what it comes down to is having clear policies, having clear processes and so on and so forth, so we can actually move on projects and do them really, really quickly. You know, we have the potential, even as biomass-based power generation projects, we have the potential of doing over 1 gigawatt in the next few years, but it requires governmental support. And what USAID has managed to do is connect us to the policymakers and try to help us with those policies.
Gentlemen, we've unfortunately run out of time, but I think Yash made the point that initiatives such as Power Africa has brought together all the players in the market, making things easier, transparent, bringing the partnerships together, and ultimately hoping to get to that vision of 2030 universal power access. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, that's all we have time for tonight. Thank you to my guest, Professor Mosad Elmissiry, Head of Energy Programs at NEPAD, Andrew Herscowitz, Coordinator for Power Africa, Yash Krishna, Managing Director, Cummins Cogeneration Kenya, and Segun Sowande, Partner, KPMG, Nigeria. Please remember to send us your comments. The details are on your screen. From myself and the Invest Africa team, it's goodbye and good night.